Everybody, this is Perch, and I was talking with a friend, and he shot me this question, just kind of as an idea for a video. And this is a case I'd love to collaborate with you. By the way, this would be a good one for us to do together. But I think that in general, when we talk about the comic book industry, there's so many ways that we've described it, that many of us have described it. It's been described as best it's ever been. It's been described as terminal and about to die. It's been described all over the place. And in many cases, people have given suggestions, people have given unhelpful suggestions. There's been lots of different discussions around comics. Uh, but where I'm kind of centering in on is to use more of a medical approach to how we talk about comics. And the approach I've come to land on is unhealthy. Other people have used that word too, but unhealthy is a good word. Unhealthy does not mean you're going to die tomorrow. It does mean that there's some symptoms that you're starting to see. It means there's some behaviors that's leading to that diagnosis. It means that there's some consequences we can start to quantify. It also allows you to get specific. One of the more frustrating aspects about how all this stuff is argued these days is that you get into the comic industry is the best it's ever been, hundreds of millions of dollars. It's like, okay, but a lot of that's driven by Scholastic, a lot of it's driven by manga, a lot of it's driven by booksellers doing different things. It's not driven by traditionally Marvel, DC, and indies. And when you're talking about comic books in a historical perspective, why it's important to talk about Marvel, DC, indies and that structure is because big companies, when healthy, when the business is moving well, become a feeder ground for the smaller companies. One of the ways you could tell any industry, not just comics, but anything, is growing into an unhealthy state is when the big companies stop providing kind of fertile ground for new companies to grow up. If you look at the success of companies like Amazon and companies like Microsoft, one of the big ways that they became, bigger and more stable and more healthy is that they created an ecosystem for smaller companies to thrive in. If you're a Microsoft partner and you got certified, you could very quickly get your business stood up, and Microsoft gave away tools and in some cases gave away value. There's an argument to be made that if Microsoft had held on to all the different aspects of their business, they would have made more money. But unfortunately, what they knew is that innovation and founding new talent and everything else wasn't always going to come from within. So if they became a good a mechanism for small companies to grow and thrive, well, then they get more powerful because they're the backbone of those companies. Those companies start to rely on them. It benefits them that if something gets too good, too powerful, they can always use their cash reserves to swallow it up. But it puts them in a good position. Marvel and DC in the past were in that same position. They were a big company. If they saw new talent kind of emerging on the indie scene, they could, lure them over. They didn't have to worry about trying to capture every new idea, every new talent, every new story. They allowed this healthy comic business. It created smaller companies to feed it and to grow. And this is natural. This is good business. It's called an umbrella business. There's a lot of different terms actually for how you do this, but this is one way an industry of vertical is healthy. That's not the way it is today. There's several small independent artists that choose never to go to the big two because it's more financially viable for them not to. There's people in the big two who find that going out is healthier, is better for them in many ways, both mentally and financially. And in some cases, you could say some of this started when Image broke off in the 90s. But Marvel and DC in the 2000s did a pretty good job of pulling it back together where they were the clear dominant companies doing different things, certainly having plenty of problems, but the overall structural business was healthy. And so when we get into these arguments of saying, well, the comic industry is better than it's ever been, it's like, depending on how you look at it, depending on how you categorize it, that could be a true statement. However, when a lot of people are debating the merits and health of comics, what they mean is U.S. traditional, what we saw in the 80s and the 90s. And if the counter argument is, well, everything evolves, so it's natural for these things to fall away over time, be replaced by something new, not really. There's disruption, and we see that in businesses all the time, where maybe you have a traditional taxi business, Uber comes along, disrupts it. That's normal, that's good, that's healthy. But it's not to say that this is a natural event. Do you think that Yellow Cab and these taxi companies, if they had an IT organization, if they had the ability to, do this themselves if they had invented the technology and mechanism of Uber first? Do you think that they would choose not to do that? Of course they would do that. They want to keep their market share. Disruption has winners and losers in it. And you can say, well, it's inevitable. It's evolution for, manga, scholastic, graphic novel, other things to take over and for Marvel and DC to fade backward. Um, is Marvel and DC bought in on that? Probably not. I mean, hopefully not. I mean, God, the worst thing in the world is if executives at Marvel and DC are sitting there going, "Well, we're gonna fade away eventually." Like, you do not want that person as your leader. But businesses don't have to be disrupted. There's plenty of cases in airlines, in hotels, and hospitality. I mean, Marriott reinvented themselves in many ways. Medicine, Johnson and Johnson reinvented themselves. Procter and Gamble reinvented themselves and remain market leaders. You could argue, same example I used before, Microsoft reinvented themselves. They saw heavy threats from Google, from Amazon, from others. Today, the Azure cloud and other aspects of their business, pretty strong. Microsoft's doing okay. Are they the same number one dominant force that they were back in the early 90s? They're sort of, actually. They're not the undisputed dominant leader, but they're dominant. Like, you don't go up against Microsoft. They're having to share the stage with some other parties, but their shareholders, their executives, they're not crying. So how does this all get to comics? And I got astray from the topic I initially was going to talk about because I wanted to give this groundwork. The U.S. comic industry is unhealthy. It doesn't mean that it's inevitable that it's a corpse, but it is unhealthy. One of the biggest ways it's unhealthy is its addiction to variance. And why variants are problematic is the more you dig into it, the more you analyze the numbers, the worse the variant picture looks. And it begs the question, this is a question that started all this off, if variants went away, or how much of the comic industry is artificially propped up because a number of whales are buying heavy dollar into variants and basically supporting other failing parts of the business. And the answer is more than you think, unfortunately. I don't think that if variants went away, it's not like tomorrow the business would crater. Unless, and this is a big unless, this is the nuance that is really required to understand and digest, unless the comic industry, the comic publishers, continue doing exactly what they're doing. If they continued using the same editorial scheme, same publishing scheme, same manner, and variants went away, you would see the giants topple. You could see a complete, evacuation. Now, this is all hypothetical because, only a complete idiot would stand on the sinking ship doing the exact same things as it's clear it's going down into the water. But as we've seen, there are some businesses that have done that. Blockbuster is an example of a company that attempted to innovate, and there's many videos about that. They attempted to innovate, but they did so in such a cautious manner, such a, still believing that they were moving from a position of strength, that in effect it was like going down with the Titanic. So why do I think variants are such a big problem? Well, it gets into the numbers. Right now, if you look at comics and you look at relaunches, and this is the key point, if you look at number one issues, what you see is that, and you've seen it in the graphs that I've shown many times before, number one issues on average are in the mid 40s of percentage of drop from issue 1 to issue 2. It's an unhealthy business. It's a case where it artificially boosts up the first issue and boosts up the belief of how the series is going to do before inevitably issue 2 kicks in and sales drop. And what you see is this diminishing effect over time. You see comics that relaunch frequently, and you see that drop from issue 1 to issue 2 become more steep and more severe. When we looked at Captain Marvel, you'd see every relaunch started to have less and less impact, and overall, the series, meaning the ongoing issues that would follow it, got weaker. It shed users rather than bringing them in. And a lot of people, including myself, look at that and go, well, the relaunch to number one strategy is short-term gains, long-term loss. But then there's another aspect to that number one that you can't ignore, and that's variance. Variants are always attached to a number one these days, and not one variant, but often many. We've done the videos talking about how there's 30 to 40 comics, 40 variants for this one comic relaunch, this absurd amount of variants. And inevitably, when you look at that comic and you look at the numbers, you see that comic blew past 100,000, did really well. In some cases, you have comics, Iron Man, Spider-Man, both come to mind, where they had upwards of, I think, 30 to 40 variants for each issue. And you get sales sometimes broaching 200,000. It's great money. So what's driving it? Is it the number one relaunch or is it the variant? Well, the answer is incredibly clear. It's the variant. Because from time to time, and it is rare these days, Marvel and DC launch a number one issue, and it's they have one variant, or in very rare instances, no variants. They have a limited series that comes out, just the one cover. And what do you see? Well, the number one still does better. There's still a drop from issue 1 to issue 2, but the drop is usually on average, it's lower than 10%. The drop is, as I was calculating out, and I don't have every single comic, but I just went through about 40 comics, and the drop for low variant number one issues was about 8% on average. The drop for heavy variants, meaning 3 or more, and that's being generous. In a lot of cases, we're talking 10 or more for the bigger titles. That drop was 46%. So what does that mean? Well, it's a very, very clear picture. It means that variants are driving sales, which is not a shocking revelation. Why would they do variants if they weren't driving sales? Well, the challenge you have here is that because of the unhealthy drop from issue 1 to issue 2, you can draw a pretty reasonable comparison if you take the monthly sales for a comic company and you say, all right, well, how many of these are based on variants? It starts to add up to a pretty significant number. And when you get variants now occurring in issue 2 and issue 3 and everything else, you know that there's an effect. If you study a comic line of an ongoing series, one that has variants every month versus one that does not, you see that the one that has variants has slightly high numbers. Of course, not a big surprise. The variants are driving more sales, so that makes sense. But those sales aren't inherently healthy. It's a business that has nothing to do with the ongoing readership of the book. We can tell that because when it goes from issue 1 to issue 2, when the number of variants drop, the sales correspondingly drop significantly as well. Why is that so dangerous for comics? Well, who's buying the variants? Are they regular readers? Are they art buyers? And are these people going to stick around? I mean, that's literally the million-dollar question. If these people don't stick around, what's going to happen to the sales of comics? They're going to tank. And that's why when I said, if the companies continue to do what they're doing, I mean, if they continue to relaunch books, if they continue to reboot things on a regular basis, if they continue to lean into the number one strategy, which the number one strategy is really based on variants, not relaunching, not refreshing, not even trying to get a bump off the number one itself. It's trying to get the bump off the variants that come with that number one issue. That's the challenge. If the comic industry continued to follow that same strategy, it is the strategy they know, but you take the variance out of the equation and you start looking at every relaunch at 8%, then diminishing returns, you get to a sizable drop extremely quickly. So the question being, if variants went away, would comic publishers, would the people in marketing distribution, would people like David Gabriel, would they change their approach, or would they just keep doing what they're doing? I'd like to say they changed their approach, but as we've seen in 2022, we're still doing things structurally in comics that they were doing in the 90s, in the 80s, in some cases the 70s. This is an industry that does not learn very quickly. This is also an industry that very much embraces this is the way we've always done it mentality. It is not healthy, not even a little healthy. Getting back to that point, I'm gonna now spend some time putting up some numbers, showing you some of the math here. But it's fairly boring math because unlike other comics, unlike other things. Remember when I put up The Walking Dead and the numbers increased over time? It was this wonderful, miraculous moment. And we've looked at Miss Marvel, and we looked at Captain Marvel, and we've looked at Saga, and we looked at all these different titles. We looked at Moon Girl and saw what happened with the trades. And those are interesting stories because they tell you different points of data. When you talk about the variance and the effect on sales, it's almost exactly the same. You can close your eyes. You can run on autopilot. You get the same answer every time up and down the line. It's remarkably stable. And in this case, that's bad news. It's very much a symptom of an unhealthy industry that they become so addicted to variance that if you play it out month by month and you start to say things like, well, maybe 20 to 25% of the revenue is coming from variance. That's, you could say, well, all right, that's just a category of how you do business. But the corresponding number to that is 20 to 25% of the variant cost is good, but on average, 40% of the revenue drop is a result of this. And it is a result of this. It's not like people are buying the comic getting turned off by variant. It means they're coming to buy the variant and then they're leaving. So the drop is connected to the variance. The variants are responsible for this because you're not building a healthy ongoing comic. You're not building stable revenue. Software companies that get into SaaS businesses, software as a service businesses, it's all about recurring revenue. That's the entire point. You want to build on that base. Well, comics could be the same, subscription revenue, but they're not. In this case, it's retrained the market to come in for number ones, buy the variants. Variants cost more. So by the way, in addition to the numbers thrown out, I'm just using apples to apples cover price. If we start to bring into the fact that variants cost more and that there's a financial difference in this number, this entire argument gets much more extreme. Now, you may say, I like variants, and good for you. That there's nothing wrong with liking variants. As an industry, though, the reliance on variants has become incredibly unhealthy. So to the original question, would the comic industry implode if variants went away? No, but it would hurt. If you talk about any business, no matter what it is, and you say, hey, let's take away 25% of your revenue, that's catastrophic. People who are not business minded would look, but you still have the 75%. Yeah, but you've cut completely into your profit margin, perhaps entirely, where you're no longer a money gaining business. It's hard to say with companies like Marvel and DC how much money is they're bringing in a certain X number of dollars, but also spending money. So how much money are they? What's the profit margin? Both companies are profitable. Don't let the conspiracy people on the internet tell you that they're not profitable. They're profitable. If you get a calculator for yourself and you work out and you look at the annual reports, you can see they are profitable. But it's not a 5x, 6x margin business. If you take 25% out of the incoming, you're getting close to either break even or actually have wandered into negative territory, depending on the financial difference there. Anyway, I've wandered a little bit. There's certainly more to talk about, but it's an interesting question. It's an interesting theory, and it's one of those cases where number one issues are not the trick. It's not the scheme. Number one issues are means to an end. It's the variant. That's why I think you do see several of the companies doing more of the anniversary issues. And look, we're going to do a issue 750 with a bunch of variants and everything else. And the trick, what a lot of us fall into is to say, oh, look, they're milking anniversary issues. They're milking reboots. Not exactly. They're milking variants, and that is an issue. Anyway, some food for thought. Let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll talk more about it, but thanks for listening.